My name is Rebecca Chung, and I am the Director of 21 CSLA State Center, and I welcome you to today's webinar. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that UC Berkeley, home of the State Center, sits on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. We encourage all people involved in this webinar to find out more about the land that they occupy, including the institutions that they belong to. Now, a little bit about 21 CSLA before we get started. 21 CSLA is the 21st Century School Leadership Academy, and it is dedicated to the professional learning and support of California's educational leaders at the teacher, site, and district level. The goal of 21 CSLA is to create more equitable learning environments that ultimately improve success for underserved students. We have an equity statement that leads our work in 21 CSLA, and it reads, "Leaders for Equity transform education to improve access, opportunity, and inclusion for students and adults, especially those who are systemically marginalized and historically underserved, so they can thrive." And with great pleasure at this time, I will turn over the microphone to Professor Jabari Mahiri, who serves as chair of the leadership board for 21 CSLA.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 13th seminar. I was in Chicago at ARA, and I was visiting a friend who was in a high-rise, and they didn't have a 13th floor. That doesn't mean anything for our conversation here this afternoon on this 13th webinar for 21 CSLA, because I've been reading the comments, and people are so excited about this conversation because it's so needed, it's so critical. At the University of California, Berkeley, we have a saying, "Educate like democracy depends on it." And I think we're at this moment where democracy really does depend on the role that we are able to play in education for equity, for diversity, for inclusion. And we have amazing hosts, panelists today that are going to present research first, and then we're going to have practitioners come behind them and have a response to this research on this exciting topic that we have. Our first presenter, Dr. John Rogers, is a professor at UCLA School of Education and Information Studies. He's also an old friend. I think we came out onto the professoriate about the same time in the 1990s, so we've been around at UCLA and Berkeley for quite a while. He's going to lead the discussion of his research on this critical topic. Also, Joseph Kahn, the Ted and Jill Dutton Presidential Professor for Educational Policy and Politics at UC Riverside, was on this panel, but is unable to make it. But we did want to represent the fact that he was definitely excited to try to be a part of this panel. Dr. Kelly Bowers, former superintendent of Livermore Valley Joint Unified School District, will be one of our practitioner panelists who will respond to the research that Dr. Rogers presents to us. Dr. Kelly Bowers has now retired, but prior to that, she was the longest running superintendent of a school district in California, and she was also our superintendent in residence at UC Berkeley's leadership programs. And additionally, Mauro Bautista, a principal at Mendez High School, actually working right up to the time of the seminar to get here in time to be a participant and one of the panelists. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Dr. John Rogers. Professor Rogers will begin his conversation about this important topic, but we also want to remind you all that there's a back channel conversation going on Padlet. So you can see the URL at the bottom, and if you're interested in continuing the conversation there on Padlet, and also you can join the conversation on Twitter with the Twitter handle that we have at 21 CSLA. And that will be put in the chat also as a reminder if you want to also engage in Twitter. So without further ado, Professor John Rogers.
Thank you so much, Jabari. It's wonderful to be here with my Berkeley colleagues, my CSLA colleagues. I think that I was here for the very first webinar This is number 13, but I think that the first one, I believe, was in the fall of 2020, and I had an opportunity then to share some emerging research about the equity impacts of the lockdowns. And today, I'm going to be talking about a different set of challenges that our public schools are facing. But before I turn to that, I'd like to start on an aspirational note. California is home to more than 9 million precious children and youth who, through their diverse identities, languages, and experiences, embody extraordinary potential. As a state, we must provide rich opportunities for young people to understand and tap into these cultural resources. We have a responsibility to enhance their creative and intellectual capabilities and foster their respect for one another and the land that sustains us all. And because young people today face unprecedented social and environmental challenges, it's imperative that they develop the civic skills and commitments necessary to build complex alliances, address shared problems, and envision a more promising future. In short, California must educate for a diverse democracy. Can we go to the next slide? I think one more slide now too. Thank you. Let me offer a quick and tentative definition of what we mean by a diverse democracy. It's a democracy in which people from different communities and with different political beliefs, interests, identities, and ways of thinking come together to address common problems and build a shared future. To create a thriving, diverse democracy, youth need opportunities to explore the full stories and histories of varied groups, to build capacities for respectful evidence-based dialogue, and to develop commitments to robust civil liberties and recognition of the dignity of fellow citizens. Next slide, please. The task of educating for a diverse democracy has never been easy or straightforward, but a set of new political dynamics has unfolded over the last couple of years, creating intense challenges for educators and communities. The heightened conflict, coarse rhetoric, and intense polarization in American politics increasingly has been directed at public schools. My colleagues and I were interested in exploring the reach of these dynamics and their effects on public education. So we asked two different questions. First, how widely felt are the highly politicized attacks on public schools? Are the prevalence of these attacks related to the partisan makeup of surrounding communities? And second, to what extent is political conflict impacting the ways that public high schools educate students to participate in a diverse democracy? Does this differ across blue, purple, or red communities? Next slide, please. Last summer, we conducted a survey with principals from 692 nationally representative high schools all across the United States. We purposefully oversampled in California, where we had 150 respondents, representative of the state as a whole. The California respondents, in fact, come from every region of the state, lead schools with a variety of student demographics, and are located in communities with different partisan leanings. We placed each high school in our study in their congressional district and then coded them for partisan leaning based on the proportion of the presidential vote in that congressional district in 2020 that went for Donald Trump. Our national study compared schools in blue, purple, and red communities. Because California has so few red communities, our California report only compares schools in blue and purple communities. Next slide. And then next slide again. So the first finding, political conflict is pervasive and growing, particularly in purple communities. The principal of a high school in our purple community told us, my high school faced the whole conspiracy theory that COVID was not real. You don't need to wear face masks. The people are sheep. We're all dupes of the federal government. I held very, very stressful parent meetings. One of the parents was concerning to me personally with his vitriol and his anger and calling me a liberal communist moron. We had mini protests, 20 adults appearing in front of my school wearing t-shirts with different slogans about anti-government rhetoric and anti-COVID rhetoric and anti-President Biden rhetoric. They were a very, very virulent, outspoken group of adults that decided to make their last stand with their children at my high school. In our survey, Almost 2/3 of California principals reported substantial local political conflict over an array of hot-button educational issues. In half of all schools, parents or community members sought to limit or challenge teaching about issues of race and racism and protections for LGBTQ student rights. In almost 1/3 of California schools, principals report community efforts to limit student access to books in the school library or social emotional learning. These figures are almost identical to the proportion of principals who reported community-level conflict on these same issues across the United States. Principals leading California high schools in purple communities were far more likely than those in blue communities to report that community conflict occurred frequently. For example, principals in purple communities were 2.5 times as likely as principals in blue communities to report frequent community conflict related to LGBTQ issues. This increasing political conflict often has resulted from intentional and organized efforts that have targeted purple communities in particular. Principals said that some parents connected to conservative national organizations, such as Moms for Liberty or Parents Defending Education, are aggressively challenging and even threatening educators over policies and curriculum on race, LGBTQ rights, and other issues. At times, principals said that parents and community members employed anti-democratic practices, such as spreading misinformation and employing threatening, denigrating, and violent rhetoric. Next slide. Finding 2, political division and community level conflict is shaping student interactions. A principal in a blue community told us, the ground shifted beneath their feet over 1.5 years, and there were significant political events, social events that occurred, the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and on, the rise of Black Lives Matter and the protests, responses to the protests, the Blue Line flag, the 2020 election, and January 6th. All these things happened while kids were in spaces that were not with us. If this wasn't during the pandemic, they would have come to school and had some conversations about those things in a space where they knew there was a really diverse set of beliefs and experiences around them. And they would have probably been careful about it typically, but instead they had these conversations around their dinner table or not. They may have had them around a Discord server, or they heard dad and mom rant and rave about that one perspective that they have. So our kids came back to school with this very narrow perspective. They struggled a little bit to have empathy for groups that they didn't necessarily understand. While this example comes from a principal in a blue community, the broader pattern of student conflict has been particularly pronounced in purple communities. 93% of California high school principals in purple communities reported that the level of political division and instability at their schools has increased since the beginning of the pandemic. None said that it had gotten better. Next slide, please. Finding 3. Many California students experience hostility and intolerance in school. Participation in a diverse democracy requires that everyone's treated with dignity and respect. Unfortunately, many California principals noted that intolerant behavior between students is on the rise. In purple communities, 64% of principals reported that the level of intolerance has increased since the pandemic, and none said that it had declined. This ugly behavior is often targeted at groups that historically have experienced a great deal of oppression. More than 3/4 of California principals report that their students had made hostile or demeaning remarks towards LGBTQ classmates. Principals in purple communities are by far most likely to say this is a common occurrence. Half of California principals reported that students have made hostile and demeaning remarks about Latinx students, and 2/3 reported that such remarks had been made about African American students. Again, principals in purple communities were far more likely than those in blue communities to report frequent assaults directed toward African American students. Before moving on, I just want to pause and note that African American students make up only 5% of all students enrolled in California public schools, yet they are the group most often targeted by classmates. Next slide, please. Finding 4. While California schools experience similar challenges as schools nationally, there are some hopeful signs that California educators may be responding differently. In our survey, California principals broke with the national pattern in a couple ways. Nationally, as school and district leaders in purple communities were less likely than those in blue communities to speak out about the importance of LGBTQ student rights. But that wasn't true in California, where leaders in all communities spoke out on this issue. California principals also differed from principals nationally in their broad support for professional development related to helping students learn about the literature and history of people from different ethnic and racial backgrounds. Our hunch is that this fact reflects the importance of statewide legislation related to ethnic studies and the ethnic studies graduation requirement that's coming up in a couple of years. Next slide. So we're at this existential moment for public schools and for our diverse democracy. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see a quote from a principal in a purple community who told us, since the pandemic, working in the school system has been traumatic in many ways. We've been beat up emotionally by parents, blamed for all the ills of society. We're tired, cut us some slack. We went into education to help students. Something needs to change or else we will all quit or retire early. It is exhausting. Of course, educators are exhausted for many reasons. Community and school level conflict makes everything harder and it saps energy. And it's also particularly exhausting when you face difficult challenges and lack the tools to address them. The challenges posed by political conflict do not have any easy answer, but I believe that principals and their schools stand to benefit when they grapple with the complexity of the problem. Next slide. That's why it's important for principals to lean into the tensions of educating toward a diverse democracy amidst anti-democratic conflict. Next slide. Before turning to these tensions, let me remind us of what we mean by a diverse democracy. This is the same quote I read before. And I want to say it's one thing to lift up these ideas on a slide, but another to promote them in settings where there's no agreement on a shared project and little or no commitment to respectful and evidence-based dialogue, civil liberties, or the dignity of fellow community members. Next slide. And that points us to three tensions. Next slide. Tension one. Educating for diverse democracy means supporting inclusive participation of parents and community members, even when some current forms of engagement heighten conflict and violence and exclusion. Now, leaning into this tension entails being able to distinguish productive and destructive forms of public engagement. Differences of opinion are vital to the democratic process, but the spread of misinformation, threats of violence, and efforts to exclude are harmful to a diverse democracy. School leaders need to reflect on and talk about such distinctions amongst themselves, with their students, with their faculty, and with the broader community. Next slide, please. Tension two. Educating for diverse democracy means fostering youth voice, even at a moment when some youth voices create a threatening and hostile climate for other youth. School leaders that lean into this tension help students see the ways that their lives are inescapably linked to other members of the school community. These leaders emphasize belonging and community, even as they encourage young people to exercise their voices. Next slide. Tension three. Educating for diverse democracy means acting politically to build support for shared values, but not leading in a partisan way. Public school leaders need to stand for a diverse democracy and encourage others to stand up as well. Leaning into this dilemma means rejecting calls to side with only those members of the school community who agree with them. Democratic leadership means building a larger community, a larger we. Next slide. Let me close with a couple quick thoughts that maybe we can come back to in the Q&A about leading for a diverse democracy. And these thoughts emerge from some of the political science literature that I've been reading lately on deepening democracy amidst anti-democratic and sometimes violent anti-democratic movements. And so for school leaders, I would argue practicing diverse democracy means first communicating in ways that diminish the sense of existential threat from the other side, and where possible, avoiding partisan scripts. It also means fostering social interaction that allows students and community members from different identity groups to see one another as less threatening than they had been imagined. Final slide. And for school leaders, practicing diverse democracy also means creating opportunities for members of the school community to participate together on projects that require them to negotiate differences as they work toward shared goals. And it also means partnering with groups and organizations that bridge understandings and build connections across diverse school communities. I'm going to close there because I'm really looking forward to hearing from our two practitioners who I know have been doing some of this work in ways that really illuminate the ideas that I've been talking about. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, John. That was an amazing presentation. And I want to add some admiration for getting through all of these complex considerations of your research in such a short, condensed time frame. But we wanted to provide time for our panelists to also respond to these really insightful and in some ways provocative considerations and tensions that you've raised for us here. We also want to remind everyone that we have our panelists as one is a former superintendent of a major district in California, and the other is a principal. So we're going to start with Dr. Kelly Bowers as a superintendent, former superintendent, to begin a response to Dr. Rogers' presentation.
Thank you for that introduction. And I would say that most people in my school district would consider the area we were in was solidly purple. So that just to give you a background on that, with about 13,000 students. So I guess I would say that as a superintendent, similar to what was said earlier, you are the lead learner and you have to also lean in. You need to have a very active role and not passive in all that is going on in leading equity and providing safe spaces for all. And so you must do that by example, but also by working with everyone, even people who are at sometimes in opposition to things that you're trying to accomplish. And so the challenge is always to make everyone feel safe and to work with everyone, your governance team, your parents, your community at large, your staff, your students, and even the civic organizations that can help. And so I think it's important to humanize everyone. We come with titles, but it's very easy to demonize and say, oh, the district or the superintendent or that board or these people. And if you really break it down and build relationships one-on-one, literally one by one with people, however they come to you, then I think you're able to humanize and meet people at a different level and build relationships that will withstand some of these other pressures. So that's extremely important. And I completely relate to what those quotes were saying. We felt very polarized. Often we felt under attack. I would say a metaphor was like a target sometimes on us because we were there and we would take the brunt of a lot of people's upset and anger. But at the root of all that, I saw a lot of fear. Fear of coming out, of people who were afraid of things they'd heard, afraid of things they'd read, and afraid of things that they thought were going to happen if change happened in any way. And I think what we realized is a lot of those fears were not based on real experiences. They were based on things they had heard. So when we had people attacking us, verbally threatening, sometimes even going to the point of death threats and wishing that we would have retribution and last judgment. I know that we set up processes and strategies for people to come instead and meet with us. It wasn't at a board meeting because at a board meeting, the board can't really respond if it's not an agenda. So that's not conducive. Town halls are not conducive because you can get kind of a mob mentality. It's really about meeting people one-on-one and talking to them and saying, so you hear all these things about critical race theory. Show me an example where that is happening with your student. And then people really couldn't, because it wasn't really happening. A lot of it is this propaganda that's been fed and people were getting very anxious over it. So those are just some of my first thoughts. I certainly have plenty more, but I know we want to hear from Mauro as well.
Thank you, Dr. Bowers. Mauro, can you join the conversation and add your insights from the school site leader perspective?
course. Good afternoon, everybody. First and foremost, I want to thank everyone for the invitation. As I'm listening to the research, I can certainly relate. And as I share a couple of experience, in no way do I assert that the experience of Mendez High School are extraordinary, because we're struggling with what the research indicated as well. This is my 14th year at Mendez as an administrator, 2 years as assistant principal, 12 years as principal. And at the end of last year, I shared with my team, my staff, that last year, 2022-2023 was the most challenging year as an admin. And with 6 weeks to go this year, I can share that if the next 6 weeks go as smooth as possible, 22-23 has been the most challenging year for me as admin. And so those quotes and the research certainly resonate. I guess a couple of examples that I can give as to how we try to do our best to lead during this challenging time is Professor Rogers shared that one of the ways to lead during this difficult time is to make sure that different voices are involved in decision making, even if the voices don't always agree. And so being a principal in LAUSD, as many of you know, because it was national news in 2019, LAUSD Teachers Union, UTLA, went on strike. And out of the strike came a lot of positive things for the school community. But amongst them was the opportunity for schools to apply to be a designated community school within LAUSD. We applied and we became part of the first cohort, and there was only 19 schools in the first cohort. Many schools did not apply, even though the opportunity to apply came with added support and added resources. And even the second cohorts and the third cohorts, not a ton of schools have applied. And so when people have asked me, why do you think more schools don't apply? Is because one of the tenets of being a community school is shared leadership. And I think one of the most difficult things for school leaders is to give up some of that control and give up some of that leadership. And so in LAUSD, in order to be a community school, you have to have a functioning local school leadership that, among other things, control all the budgets, meaning all budgets have to go through local school leadership. It must be approved through local school leadership, as opposed to a more traditional setting where maybe 5 or 10% of budgets go through a committee and the principal has discretion over the other 90%. And so in these local school leadership meetings, you do get an opportunity to share differing perspectives, whether they be political or just in terms of school policy. And we have to figure it out together because we have to make decisions together. I think the other powerful thing from the presentation was the second point, which was student voice. And I consider myself very blessed to be working in the community where I grew up. Mendez High School is located in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of LA City, which is just east of downtown LA. And as an adult, I was even more blessed to buy a home here in Boyle Heights. And so I'm truly a Boyle Heights kid and also a resident of Boyle Heights as an adult. And I think sometimes as adults, we may fall into the trap of like, hey, I've been there. I know what I'm talking about. You young people, you have to listen to us because we're the adults. When the reality is the young people of Boyle Heights are living an experience in 2023 that is different from 2013, different from 2003, different from 1993 when I was in high school. So you can't fall back into that. The young people, our students, they have important experience to share and important insights that we as adults do not have the opportunity to live because we're not living their experience as 14, 15, 16, and 17-year-old. And so opportunities for students to offer their suggestions, their thoughts on what's going on in the school, and for us to actually listen is very, very critical because their lens is distinct, it's different, and sometimes what students will share is not necessarily what you as a school leader may want to hear, but that is critical to move the work forward, keeping students' voice in perspective. So what are some of the ways that students can have voices? Of course, traditional members of school site council, and we had an incredible student leadership teacher for many years who created a student senate here, which was great. She became assistant principal. We lost her and we lost that senate, but we're trying to figure out a way to bring it back, because that was a great way to have student voice in our work. And so let me pause there, because otherwise
And I can chime in and add about student voice. One of the things that we did was, as a superintendent, after the murder of George Floyd, after the tragedy that happened, it really kind of shook everybody in many ways, and also activated some voices that we hadn't heard. And so we reconnected with our young alumni, and particularly our students of color who had come back from college and had a couple of years under their belts and different perspectives to bring back to us. And so we spent that summer just listening. And I like to talk, I'm a very passionate speaker, but I just listened and just absorbed and took in their experiences of what it was like to be a student of color, or in the suburbs, and when they were, very far and few between. And what we realized at first, there was some anger and upset. And even though these students were empowered and educated and went on to college, so they obviously had some good experiences in our school, but they did share that they had also experienced microaggressions, that they had also had things happen to them that they would not wish for others. And so we took it in, and it was really painful. As Mara said, you don't want to hear it. You won't want to hear that you're less than, or that you have not made every child feel safe and watched. But we listened, and what we found out was that the students originally thought that maybe the adults had swept things under the rug, but eventually they said, no, we hadn't swept it up. We didn't know. We honestly didn't know. And it was because the students in our community had kind of developed these ways and more ways of interacting where they normalized it, and they had learned to cope. So they denied some of their cultural things. We had little kids saying, they would ask for Lunchables to be normal, to deny their culture rather than bring their cultural food to school because someone might think it was different or say, ooh. And so we had students who didn't go by their given name because they wanted to have a normal name, what they perceived as normal, so they could fit in. And so all these things happened. And again, these were systems type things that were happening that no one at our board level or superintendent would ever decree those things. No one would vote to have those happen, but they were just happening. And so our students came forward to say, these are the great things that our school district did for them, educated them, gave them power, gave them critical thinking so they could challenge these things, and made it safe for them to tell us. But then they also said, these were where we fell short. And then they gave us almost demands, but they definitely said, and these are the things that need to change. And there's a sense of urgency, change them for the kids now, change them for the future. And so that was like our marching orders. And hearing from the kids made a huge difference. They weren't coming in with a political agenda. They weren't running for office. Their parents weren't telling them what to say. These are kids who had formed their own thoughts about their experiences. And every suggestion they gave us, we immediately began to implement, because people will listen to the voices of our youth in a much different way than they will if they think it's a bureaucrat or administrator or just someone who has a political agenda or something to gain. And so that was a very powerful experience for us as a district. And for me, after 30-something years in education, I was still learning so much from the youth. And we created a video, and it was called Unmasking. Of course, after COVID, we actually took literally the masks, Unmasking the Truth, Voices and Visions for the Future. And it was from our students. They were phenomenal. We had a professional videographer who worked with them, and it was very profound. And we use it as a teaching tool with our staff, with people who question, why are we doing this? Why are we talking about this? What does this have to do with? Listen, it's for our kids. Mm-hmm. So that was very powerful.
We really appreciate these specific examples of how as administrators, as school leaders, you all were leaning in, and we recognize that a key consideration that came from Professor Rogers' presentation of his research is this notion of leaning in rather than retreating. So I want to pose one question to Professor Roberts, and then another question to our practitioners, and at the same time encourage all of our participants to raise any questions that you have in the chat. So Professor Rogers, were there examples, specific examples of how principals actually engaged in leaning into these difficult situations that were, reflective of what your findings were? And additionally, were there ways that, you all in your research team found that these kinds of practices on the part of leaders were supported either by the school community or by the district or something like that in order to provide some cover and support for leaders doing these difficult actions of leaning into these very, very problematic concerns?
I should say we are just beginning to do a new set of interviews with principals around the country to try to gather exactly the sorts of stories that Professor Mahiri is kind of pointing to, stories about principals creating bridging opportunities, about district leadership, creating buffers and space for school leaders to do this work. And importantly, stories about community organizations and youth organizations who are forging alliances to support this idea of educating for a diverse democracy. One finding from our survey that I think speaks at least indirectly to your question is that across all partisan contexts, when principals themselves were civically and politically engaged, in other words, when they regularly followed the news, when they talked to friends and family about social and political issues, and when they participated in efforts to improve their own communities on their own time, they were more likely to speak out against anti-gay legislation. They were likely to take steps to talk about the importance of tolerance and respect, to talk about the need to have curriculum that's addressing issues of race and racism in our society. It was also the case that when districts spoke about and had policies that addressed the importance of civic education and educating for democracy, principals were more likely to engage in those activities. So leadership, both at the district level and at the school level, related to democracy, led to more practicing of diverse democracy.
Well, that leads us right into a question for our practitioners. So what supports did you all find being most impactful or effective when you were doing this difficult work? And let's start with our principal practitioner first. Are there supports in your system for this difficult work? You can't stand as an individual alone in the midst of all of these slings and arrows that may be coming around these difficult questions that parents have, the community members have, et cetera. Talk to us a little bit about if and what kinds of supports are there for leaders to do this difficult work.
Well, I guess I'll try to talk briefly about support at the district level, right? So the central offices, and then I'll talk about support at the school side level.
Mm-hmm.
So Mendes High School and LAUSD is very unique in that we belong, of course, to the big district, LAUSD, but within LAUSD, we also belong to a network of schools called the Partnership for LA Schools. So I actually have two supervisors, our district supervisor and the partnership our supervisor. And it's our experience, it usually on the district end, the big district, it's a lot more black and white, right? You got to follow district policy, cookie cutter policy, even though every school is very unique and distinct. And within the partnership, it's a lot more flexible. And so I think understanding that these issues are not so black and white, and there needs to be some flexibility in how we tackle them is always very helpful, and being supported with that is useful. And then at the school side level, what's very helpful is having team members that are also willing to lean into the work. So not just yourself as the educator, but also team members as well. And I'll give two brief examples. So at Mendes High School, I myself, having been born in Mexico, and then Boyle Heights traditionally having been a neighborhood, well, recently a neighborhood with a lot of Mexican roots in them, like to uplift our Mexican traditions. And so we, of course, were called out on the fact that demographics are shifting, and we have a lot more Central American immigrants coming into the neighborhood, into the school, in addition to other members of our school community who don't happen to be from the Americas. And so we were called out on that, and we had to make adjustments, and it was a team adjustment on making sure that when we celebrate everybody and not just one group. And then also Boyle Heights is, if you're familiar with Boyle Heights, it's a neighborhood that's over 90% Latinx. And our school ourselves, we're about 98% Latinx. And our Black student population has ranged from about 3 students to maybe about 8 or 9. We were, one of our Black teachers, the teacher that I mentioned earlier, Ms. Ginger Stemnak, who's now assistant principal at Jordan. She's outstanding. She called us out as a school community for not addressing racist behavior. And so obviously when that got called out, we were like, okay, what is it? What is it that you're seeing that we're not seeing? And she said, well, the N-word, like the N-word is everywhere. The kids are listening to music with the N-word. Kids are saying the N-word and everyone walks around and that's okay. She goes, that's a trigger for me. And that was something that we were not seeing. And so we had to lean into that very difficult conversation about us. Yes, she was right. We were letting this go. We were playing music at lunch, even if it was a radio edit, you knew it was the N-word. And we were allowing that. And then, yes, the students currently, as young people, are using the N-word, and we had to make sure that we addressed that because it was made very clear that was not okay. So those are just a couple of examples.
I'm glad you indexed that, Mario, because we're going to come back to that really provocative issue of certain stakeholders in our community being more targeted than others. Professor Rogers talked about only 5% of school population in California are African-American, and yet the incidence of hateful actions and responses to their presence is much higher. But we're going to come back to that in a minute, but I wanted to stay on this line of having both a site leader perspective as well as a district level perspective. And I want to add to the district level perspective, to the superintendent level perspective, Kelly, what is the role of superintendents in terms of balancing or keeping their school boards satisfied and advocating for these best practices in the midst of these contentious conversations?
And that's a really interesting question. It's one that I did a lot of studying on. What I think the most important thing is to realize the distinction is a board is they're nonpartisan, but they are elected officials. So by nature, there are constituents who have voted for them that often have a certain leaning themselves. And so they are actually much more at risk for, if they don't appease the people who voted for them, of being in a cycle of being out. Whereas a superintendent, if they have the support of the board, can actually accomplish a lot of things because we don't need 10,000 votes and we're not up for election, we're appointed. And so we can actually, we need 3 to 5 votes. And as long as we work within those constraints and make sure that our board is aware and can support us, then we can be their buffer, but we can also take the heat or be the target, I guess, so that they don't have to be. And so I think it's about bringing people along. On my board of 5, I had very conservative, and I also had very progressive, and then everywhere in between. And yet we would find ways for me to, as an administrator, make things happen. And everything didn't have to go to a board vote, because a board vote in a polarized purple community is going to be divisive by nature. And the very young people that we're trying to protect with some of the policies and the equity work we're doing, if it's put out in that public forum and open for everyone to make their comments, it's actually sometimes becomes more hurtful. So I was able to work with my board to say, instead of, some of these things, I will do an affirmation. A superintendent's affirmation doesn't need a board vote. So my affirmation will say that all kids are our kids and that all children in all of these instances will be protected and taken care of. We also did some things around our LGBTQ plus community when there was a lot of tension and polarization about, should you have a pride resolution? Should you raise a flag? And so what I did was I met with the groups and found out that we didn't need to be, what they really wanted was all kids to feel safe. And everybody wants that, no matter where you are on the spectrum. It's just their idea of what was safe was different. And so as we worked with our groups, we were able to see that we could have displays that shows our pride, and we could have a resolution, but we also needed to focus on one that every board member could feel strongly about, because there's a range of resolutions too in some. And so we were able to find verbiage that everybody could get around, because the most important thing to me was that we had a 5-0 vote to show we're going to have a pride resolution. And we put up electronic marquees, which don't require a board vote to have our pride flag. So our kids were able to see a symbol that this is a safe place without having to go through the rigmarole of a board action to change the rules about what flies, because nobody needs a board action to put something on an electronic marquee, and nobody needs board action to hang up ribbons. So we hung up rainbow ribbon everywhere. And so our students were able to then make sure our school sites were safe and let the adults, go back and forth with each other elsewhere. And the board can get around that because they don't want to be beaten up every day and they want to be reelected. And so this way, they were able to get around what we were doing without having to have this pressure put on them to have these major board votes over things that we knew were divisive and polarizing.
Thank you. And people who are participating are really saying they appreciate these very specific examples that you all are given. And I want to turn the conversation. We have time for just 2 more questions. And I want to ask one of those to you, John Rogers, and the other one will be to our entire panel. You can jump in as you choose. You may not have the answer because you already said that this research is iterative and is also in process. But an interesting question has come from our participants, and that is, what are the implications of your findings and on this tension for research in terms of how it identifies educational policy and practice related to curriculum, to leader training, to professional development? It's a really big question. So maybe you can just take this notion of leader training and curriculum. What are the implications of this? And you touched on it a little bit, talking about when schools deal with issues of equity and democracy, that somehow begins to pave the way. But any more details that you could share with us as leaders and practitioners around what your research implies?
Yes, I would say a couple things. One is that we need to lean into our work, whether it's at a school site, at a district, or at university level, with a big vision in mind. We have to have a larger purpose than simply raising test scores, even if we might care about that. And I think one of the purposes that we should embrace collectively is the notion that we want to promote and deepen a multiracial democracy in California. And so we want to think about the ways that our curriculum supports the ability of young people to analyze, to engage in inquiry, to participate with one another, to recognize the full history of our society, to demonstrate their respect and their acknowledgement of the dignity of their classmates, etc. The other point I would make is that I think that there's been a tendency, for some good reasons, to shy away from the notion that educators, and particularly educational leaders, should embrace a civic role. And I think part of the reason why we've been shy about that is that we don't want members of our school communities to feel excluded because the leader has a different position than they do. And certainly all members of the school community should feel like they have a stake in their public school. But at the same time, we want school leaders to have this civic identity where they're talking about the importance of democracy, and they're talking about the importance of these values of diversity. And that means that in our schools, in our districts, and in our universities, we have to select for and encourage folks who are deeply connected to their communities, who are participatory, and who want to promote greater participation on their faculty and in their school communities.
Thank you so much. And in the small time that we have remaining, I want to throw this provocative question out, and I'm going to ask you to be very concise, even though it's going to open up a set of considerations that are hard to tap down. And that was what I alluded to earlier, like the African-American students who are only 5% of the whole school population, but they're targeted way more than other groups. So as educational administrators and as researchers, what can we say is needed to protect our most vulnerable populations, those who are marginalized because of race, or marginalized because of second language issues, or marginalized because they're immigrants, or maybe have disabilities? How do we set up school systems and processes that ensure that we, one, identify, and secondly, protect those who are most in the crosshairs of this vitriol and controversy. And I'll just start with you, Dr. Bowers.
Okay, I'll focus on concise. I think it does come with first being aware and also training, aware of your own biases and aware of the kinds of things that are going on. And so again, listening to the students, being aware, not being denial. And it's really important. We had done a lot of training with faculty, but we also had administrators, but every person who has contact with our children, whether it's the food service, the custodian, the yard supervisor, all of those people are giving cues and they're interacting and interfacing even sometimes more often with our families. And so creating these safe spaces at school where everybody is valued comes with every single interaction with every person. And so, and I think it's also important that we get past the whole idea we're just, if we're not racist, then we're okay. We have to be anti-racist. We have to be the kind of people who will stand up and make change and dismantle inequities when we see them, not just passively sit there. So I think that's what I see the difference is from people who will just say, well, I'm not doing anything bad, but I'm just going to sit here. And if other people do, no, we all have to take that seriously, and we need to nip it in the bud every time because children are watching and counting on us.
Wonderful, wonderful. Mauro.
I also try to be concise, and this is easier said than done. And I'll say that because of my 14 years as an admin, 12 years as a principal, it's going to be easier for me to say and do this than a first year, second year principal. But certainly there has to be a lot of humility so that when you hear these critical observations, you don't take it personally and then like shut it down or dismiss it. I said, no, that's not true. I mean, Mendes is all about inclusivity. Racist actions are not taking place here. That's not the way to go, as Professor Rogers indicated. You have to lean in, and you have to have a team that will lean in with you and have those difficult conversations. Out of this observation that Ms. Stemnock brought up, which by the way was incredibly valid, we were able to create an anti-slur policy, which we've never had at the school, which particularly targeted the N-word and the F-word, which were two words that were very prevalent at the school site. And I'm not going to say that if you walk into Mendes High School for 180 days, you're not going to hear these words, but you're certainly going to hear it a lot less and hopefully see adults address it more than we did prior to this. We were also able to start a BSU chapter, and this year for the very first time, we were able to send 3 of our students on trips to historically Black universities, which we had never done before. We were very proud of that as well. So
really specific example. Thank you so much. And Professor Rogers, you have the last word.
So let me point out that these issues have been around a long time. And I think that these questions of racism are embedded in our history of democracy and our struggle for democracy. If I might close with a brief passage that when at the close of World War II, W.E.B. Du Bois said, democracy has failed because so many fear sharing power. Their fear, he said, is grounded in the belief that a world full of intelligent, healthy, and free people is impossible, if not undesirable. And Du Bois went on to declare that fear is false. He imagined a more hopeful future made possible by what he called a vital, gigantic effort to realize real education for the broadest intelligence and for evoking talent and genius on a scale never attempted in this world. And I think even with all of the crisis that's been created by the political conflict, that world is still possible. And educators like the ones on this panel are trying to bring it forth.
Professor Rogers, thank you for ending us on a positive note. I want to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Chung, to close us out.
Yes, please join me in thanking our researcher and also our panelists for today's very powerful dialogue. This dialogue is being recorded and will be archived on the 21 CSLA website. And we will also produce a brief with the highlights of today's sharing for future use. We have also shared a feedback form in the chat for your use. Please give us feedback so that we continue to produce content that is of interest to you. And also, we provided a link to our website so that you can find out more information or join our mailing list to hear about future events. Again, thank you so much for coming today. Thank you to our researcher and our panelists, and we wish you a great week.